You talked about Leninism creating, I think you called it veins of steel. I don't think most Americans are very familiar with Leninism either in its initial form, right, how it modifies Marxism, to say nothing of its Chinese form, which is a modification on top of that. So what is this Leninism of which you speak?
Marxism, as we know, is an economic ideology, and it's all about creating ultimately an equalitarian or equal society through an equal distribution of goods, but to be achieved through a process of, quote, dialectical change. A Leninist party is designed to accelerate the natural historical forces of change through the active intervention of a vanguard party, which accelerates the course of history through its own violent actions. And therefore, it's a history accelerator. That's as they see it. Of course, when applied to China's own circumstances, this Leninism essentially has all the hallmarks of Stalin's party. It's like Stalinism frozen in time. It is an unrelenting discipline anchored in absolute loyalty to the leader himself. And this is rehearsed time and time and time again in the party's internal ideological discourse and reflected in what the party does in practice.
So we talked a bit about how Xi's father is purged. He also becomes at certain times unpurged. Mao dies. Deng takes over. And I think this gets into something worth talking about, which is the party, you described it as a bit like the Stalinist party frozen in time, but it also is then, because of its fealty to the leader, able to make quite radical changes. So how does the Communist Party in China, and to say, and beyond that, China itself, change after Mao?
It's gone through, I think, two big changes. The first reaction under Deng Xiaoping, who effectively replaced Mao in 1978, was called the Great Period of Reform and Opening. And reform meant basically introducing market disciplines into the economy rather than state planning. And opening meant we, in order to grow, need to open to the outside world. He didn't fundamentally change its Leninism. He certainly changed its Marxism. He changed the economic ideology in a quite artful way by saying that at this period of economic history, that the factors of production needed to be fully unleashed in order to pull China out of poverty, and therefore it was necessary to contemplate and embrace a long period of inequality while that occurred. And when asked how long, he said dozens of generations, which you don't have to be a mathematical genius to work out that's hundreds of years, dozens of generations. And that orthodoxy effectively enabled market-based reforms in the economy domestically and engaged with the capitalist world externally, which is how, frankly, a generation or two of Americans, and Australians for that matter, became familiar with Deng's China, Jiang Zemin's China, Deng's successor, and Hu Jintao's China, who was Jiang Zemin's successor, because the overriding ambition was to grow the economy, bring people out of poverty, and make China a global economic great power, effectively for 35 years, right through until 2012, starting way back in 1978. The second big change after Mao, though, is with Xi Jinping. He becomes General Secretary of the party at the end of 2012, and he has changed that ideological script again back to what I would call the Marxist left, a much more state-driven and party-driven economy, and with much tighter levels of Leninist control.
I want to track how he gets into position to do that. So I was just doing my simple math. I think when Mao dies, Xi is 23 or so.
Thereabouts, yeah.
So what are the positions he holds? The young guy, he'd been in the countryside a bunch, his father, a complicated figure. What is his path upwards? And what makes him a figure who keeps getting promoted upwards by the Chinese Communist Party?
Through this period of reform and opening, which is quite interesting. If we've looked at our Machiavelli carefully in The Prince, Machiavelli often speaks of the need to mask one's own ambitions and to mask one's own ideas while being a loyal servant of the prince of the time before you yourself end up in power. So, and of course, there are parallel axioms in Chinese traditional political wisdom about that as well. So bear that in mind as we trip through his political career. By the late 70s, early 80s, he lands a position as the private secretary to the then Minister for Defense, whose name is Geng Biao. And this was before I met the guy down in Xiamen. He spent a couple of years doing that, and he's always prided himself in therefore having something of a military grounding or military background. He then undertakes prefecture-level positions as party secretary, where he often refers to how much he learnt from working closely with the peasants on the ground. As party secretary in a prefecture, it's to raise local living standards, to organise, shall we say, agricultural production, to ensure that agricultural surpluses are able to be sold on private markets on weekends, and so that you begin to see the emergence of a local, as it were, semi-capitalist economy.
So kind of technocratic governance job.
Technocratic governance, and it's a standard pathway to ultimate advancement. He then is elevated to become Vice Mayor of Xiamen, which is one of China's 4 special economic zones at the forefront, not of just domestic economic reform, like in the countryside, but of opening to the outside world. Where I encountered him for the first time, I'm sure he does not recall meeting me. I'm sure he met a whole bunch of foreign barbarians at the time. And then he slowly is elevated to the point that he ends up as the provincial party secretary of the entire province of Fujian. He then ends up for a long period of time as provincial party secretary of the province of Zhejiang. And then he ultimately goes to Shanghai as party secretary before he's then elevated by Jiang Zemin to the center when he ultimately becomes, in 2008, vice president of the country, vice chairman in time of the Central Military Commission.
So what is his reputation in this period? The Chinese Communist Party, 110 million members, many, many, many people vying in various bureaucratic positions for advancement. Why is she, almost unique among them, moving up and up and up and up? What are other people saying about him? What is he considered to be good at?
In the Chinese Communist Party ecosystem, it is invariably advantageous to be what they call Hong Dai, which is second generation red. Because his father is Xi Zhongxun, and his father has been obviously rehabilitated in the reform and opening period, it is of no small advantage in your own career elevation. Mind you, his major competitor for the job at the top, a guy called Bo Xilai, he was also the son of another revolutionary leader called Bo Yibo, and he was on a similar, as it were, career trajectory. And for those of us in the China analytical world, these two careers were moving towards a point of collision. And of course, those in and around Xi Jinping and those otherwise opposed to Bo Xilai dealt with Bo Xilai. So that's one element of his advancement. The other is at a technocratic level in terms of the growth data coming out of Xiamen, coming out of Fujian, coming out of Zhejiang, and coming out of Shanghai. He has an impressive set of numbers to demonstrate to the party center that he's not just a political show pony. I think he's always, as I reflect back on his career, been a safe hands sort of guy, keeping his provinces stable while allowing the private sector to do its bit.
I think sometimes from the outside, we look at the Chinese Communist Party and don't see politics. We just see kind of a lockstep organization. We don't understand its internal workings very well, but it does have politics. It does have factions. It has a lot of people in it. Why him? What is his pitch to the party? And what do his supporters want from him? What do the other factions fear in him? Like what is the understanding of how he becomes a leader and why he becomes a leader and what it means that he is one chosen to be the leader?
And this is the question that many of us in the analytical world are least equipped to answer because we weren't in the room. But let me have a go anyway. The kingmaker at this stage is Jiang Zemin, even though he'd been formally out of the position for a decade. Jiang Zemin, wise old bird. I mean, I met him a couple of times in my political life, and who loved to sing, by the way. We once had him in Sydney when he was mayor of Shanghai himself. He insisted on performing on stage at the Sydney Opera House, so we made sure there was no one else in the Opera House at the time. But he liked it. He was performing on stage at the Opera House. Yeah. He could say he'd sung there.
That's a good singer?
The Chinese would say "mama hu hu," which is, yeah, okay. A bit like me in the shower.
Sure. A confident singer.
A confident singer, a man who likes to sing.
I admire that.
Yeah, that's right. It requires a limited level of self-awareness in order to really enjoy it. But anyway, Jiang Zemin.
Or a knowledge you can purge whoever doesn't like the way you sounded.
That's true. Mind you, as a junior Australian diplomatic official at the time, I appropriately applauded this performance at the Opera House. That's kind of what you do. But anyway, you roll the clock along. I think Jiang Zemin has worked out that there are problems in terms of party corruption, that there are problems in terms of indiscipline, and there are problems in terms of allowing any further, as it were, slide in control, given where they ended up in 1989. So, against the alternatives that they were faced with at the time, I think they saw in Xi Jinping someone who was a party guy, first and foremost, and secondly, having presided over a couple of, or three, heavily reformist provinces, Shanghai, Fujian, and Zhejiang, which were very much at the cutting edge of economic progress, that the economic reform program would be safe, the opening to the outside world's economies would be safe, as it would be safe in terms of party political control. I think that's why they made their bet with Xi Jinping, and I think Jiang Zemin, by the time he died only a couple of years ago, would have been deeply surprised by how much Xi Jinping then set out to change the center of gravity of the Chinese political economy in a big way.
Why would he have been surprised by that?
Because he assumed that the economic reform program would continue, that there would still be a lot of space for the Chinese entrepreneurial class, that China's international economic engagement would continue, that China would progressively integrate itself with the global economy. And instead what he saw, certainly by the time we get to 2015, is Xi Jinping turning the levers very much towards the Marxist left. Greater role for central planning, lesser role for, shall we say, interim inequality as Deng had conceived of it originally. And at the center of this, Xi Jinping's rehabilitation of an old Maoist saying, which was along these lines: it doesn't matter whether we're talking about north, south, east, and west, whether we're talking about the government, the military, the academy, or commerce, or society, the party leads in all. And Xi Jinping pronounced that and brought it back with a certain Maoist flourish. That's what would have surprised Jiang Zemin.
The thing that I had heard of him as being known for was a series of anti-corruption campaigns. So tell me about that side of his story.
I think during the period in which he was party secretary, I haven't seen a strong evidence trail that he has led at the provincial level crackdowns against corruption. At the same time, as soon as he takes over as party general secretary for the entire Communist Party at the end of 2012, the first thing he does, almost, is to launch a nationwide anti-corruption campaign. So he has been, I think, observing, noting, seeing how corruption under his predecessors had moved from a retail level to a commercial level to an industrial scale. And he very quickly draws out the analogies with the collapse of the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and says, in effect, that the fish rots from the head. And what happens when a fish rots from the head is that ideological corruption gives rise to physical corruption, gives rise to the dissipation of all forms of political discipline. And he saw that as fundamental to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union has become this sort of long-playing training video for various folks in the Chinese Communist Party of everything that you should not do.
Tell me the way, as you understand it, because he's written quite a lot about it, Xi Jinping would narrate the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party. Because I think here, the story that's largely believed is the Soviet Union collapsed under its own contradictions and Ronald Reagan's defense buildup and moral leadership. I think that's not how they see it in China. So how does Xi Jinping see it?
One, remember in the Gorbachev period, it was governed by these dual disciplines of glasnost and perestroika, which translated effectively mean glasnost, opening, and perestroika, reform. Sound familiar? To reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping. So he's got this rolling around on the back of his head that if you unleash too much of the capitalist impulses of the Chinese people, like the Russian people, then ultimately you're going to shake the inherent disciplinary structures of the ruling party, point one. Point two, what he said more specifically, particularly in a remarkable speech he gave, I think, in 2013, to a meeting of funsters, otherwise called the Propaganda and Ideology Department of the CCP. That should be a fun conference if ever you want to go to one. I've never been invited, but I think that's where they really get into their Marxism and Leninism and propaganda together. And that's where he spoke most clearly about the corrosive influence of capitalist values and about the attrition of communist ideological values in the last days of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The third reason he gives in his extensive corpus of writings and teachings is his wistful reflection that there was not one single man prepared to stand up in the Soviet Red Army to defend the party when things got to extremists in 1991. And so it has caused him again to double down in terms of his determination that the party will always be in control of the army, absolute control of the army.
You mentioned being in China not long before Tiananmen Square. And I've certainly read many histories of China where the sense is that the Chinese Communist Party's response to Tiananmen Square, very different from how it's understood in the US as this moment of horrific crackdown and barbarity, is in another sense the moment the Chinese Communist Party decided not to be the Soviet Union, that it was not going to allow an economic opening to lead to the kind of social rights and discontent that could shake their power.
Yeah, I'd finished my diplomatic posting by then, but I happened to be back in Beijing at the time, working in a different incarnation. And we arrived in Beijing on the 20th of May, which was the day they declared martial law, and we're already into those massive set of student protests within the square. And of course, the crackdown, the military crackdown, and when all the students were killed was on the 4th of June. So because our entire program of whatever else we were supposed to be doing was cancelled because of chaos under heaven, I then went wandering in the square for a week to talk to all these kids. And it was remarkable to see the spontaneous outburst from kids from, and not just kids, not just university students, but from other units of the Chinese Communist Party calling out for freedom and democracy. I remember, if you've been to Beijing, walking to the square for the first time, coming down across the ceremonial bridges in front of Mao's portrait beneath the Gate of Heavenly Peace to look at the square for the first time. And I'd seen the square on multiple occasions when it's full of the normal Communist Party paraphernalia. And this time, it was like a massive, comprehensive exercise in iconoclasm. That is, to the left was the history of the Museum for the History of the Chinese Revolution, which had one giant flag planted on top in the Chinese characters saying Minzhu, democracy. Great Hall of the People, full of big character posters, as they call them, calling for the purge of a whole bunch of people within the Chinese leadership who are old-fashioned leftists. And then in front of you, there was this crowd of, I think on our particular day, 500,000 kids in the middle. It's quite a large gathering.
Yeah, the scale is unbelievable.
And then in front of them, as I looked, there were these parade marshals who were organizing individual, shall I say, protest marches of various units of the party. And I looked to see which ones they were. One protest group from the Central Party School, another protest group from such and such a foreign policy academy. And so it went on. And so as I wandered around the square and saw this site for the first time, as a scholar or as a student of Chinese, modern Chinese history in particular, but classical Chinese history as well, I could see the instinctive reaction, feel the instinctive reaction of someone like Deng, an old-fashioned Leninist, who would just say, this is 搞乱, Chinese expression meaning creating chaos. And I had this enormous sense of foreboding that the clock was already ticking. So why did they do it? I think Deng had concluded that unless he drew parameters around this, that the party would rapidly lose power, and furthermore, that you would have this sort of chaos spread right across China. And so they acted. But then through the rest of the 90s, through until probably about 2000, there continues this internal debate within the Chinese Communist Party about whether we could execute a form of political transition to a Singaporean-style long-term democracy, or guided democracy as they would see it, in order to create an exit ramp for the Chinese Communist Party over time. After Deng died in 1997, that debate rapidly reached its conclusion, and they said, no, we're hanging on for the long term. And that's where I see the fundamental changes having occurred. And remember, that's a decade before Xi Jinping comes to power.
So one thing we've seen under Xi is first a lot of consolidation of power, but also a pretty hard crackdown on Chinese civil society, rights lawyers, labor organizers, journalists, international NGO workers. Tell me about freedom in China under Xi and why he has felt the need to do this.
From his first year in office, from 2013, you could already see the directives going out to pull in on the reins of control over the exercise of freedom in multiple domains. Religious freedom, for example, the independence of journalists, to the extent that they had it before, but they did have some. There was some investigative reporting underway. The legal system, the independence of lawyers, and also those who had been engaged in academic level discussions about, shall we say, other forms of democratic governance experimentation in China at the village level. Xi Jinping's conclusion was that all these added up to an erosion of the Leninist control of the party, and therefore crackdowns unfolded. In the case of religion, because religious practice is so widespread in China, it's not an abolition of all forms of religious expression, not at all, but reining in anything which was not authorized, so that if you were to look at it in 2026, it's vastly less free than it was a decade before.
More recently, we've seen some purging happening in the military. What have you made of that?
With the military in particular, he has sought to reassert his control. It's not just that we've seen multiple senior Chinese commanders, including those in the Central Military Commission, removed, but in the last several years, we've seen 100 senior PLA generals purged as well. What's it about? Why has he done it? He genuinely thinks that corruption in the military impedes the professional capacity of the military to execute its mission in relation to Taiwan or other contingencies. The second is, and here it's harder for us to reach these judgments, but I have some confidence in them, he's not really prepared to brook a whole lot of internal dissent within the military or alternative views. The most recent purge, for example, of Zhang Youxia, who was the effectively deputy commander of the Central Military Commission, a lifelong friend of Xi Jinping's, going way back when, and through their fathers, reflected an ultimately unemotional view that unless you are 1,000% on board the Xi Jinping bus, then it's not the place for you. So,
and in what ways were these figures, these officers, not fully on the Xi Jinping bus?
Here we have to speculate. It's not as if they were engaged in preparations for a military coup. That's not the nature of the beast. It's more internal disagreement, I suspect, about the nature of levels of military preparedness for, shall we say, deploying the PLA against and into Taiwan contingencies.
So an officer who says in a meeting, I think this would be a disaster, is not long for the world?
Or an officer who says, senior officer who may say, Comrade Chair, I think we have 2 or 3 capability sets which need to be further improved. That would be the more cautious way of putting it. Whereas my suspicion is that Xi Jinping's response to that will be to say, you guys are supposed to be providing absolute confidence in the system that we're ready. How can I therefore be trustful of your leadership of the system when you yourself are the sources of doubt? Now that, I have to say, is hypothesis. I do not have strong evidence points of that, but it's not just a corruption equation. I've also seen American analysts say, for example, that the purges in the military therefore make it much less likely that Xi Jinping would deploy the PLA against Taiwan in the coming years. My experience of these things is that for everyone who is purged, there's a queue of 100 people waiting to take the job. PLA is a very big beast.
How much are the corruption purges, the corruption campaigns, about corruption, and how much are they about control?
I think it's control being the dominant factor in the equation. And therefore, the ability of the system to be able to deploy a corruption file against anybody on anything is large in a formidable security apparatus. Remember, in the organization department of the Chinese Communist Party, which is basically the Uber personnel department, everyone has a file. And on that file goes a whole bunch of stuff. And some of it may well be fabricated. So it is ultimately about whether I choose to pull your file out.
So you, for this PhD thesis, this book, you read everything Xi Jinping has written, which is quite a lot. I find this to be an interesting thing about him. He is much more well-published than most world leaders.
That's true. Of course, at the end of the day, we don't know how much is the hand of Xi Jinping, right. How much is it his writing group of people who may get 2 or 3 lines of instruction and off they go, and how much of it is actually a formal party document which simply has his imprimatur later on.
I'm often not sure that matters. I have a belief that is not always shared in my profession, that the things politicians say in public are much more important than the things they say in private.
You're absolutely right. Having been a political practitioner myself, you are very mindful as a political practitioner of the parameters you set for yourself for the future, for your party for the future, and for the country, as opposed to private ruminations over a beer.
Yeah, politicians will tell you all kinds of things. They shade to the audience in private. They muse. When they say things in public, it is a steadier signal of where they're actually going to go. And we treat it the opposite. We, in my profession, we love the off-the-record comment. We love what is said over a beer. We think that is like a guide to the truth. And it's often, I think, a way in which we badly get the future wrong. Like if I understood the Republican Party from what Republican members of Congress told me privately over the course of the Trump era, I would have predicted it completely wrongly. Whereas if you take seriously what they do in public and their speeches, you get a fairly good sense of where it's going, which is all to say, what is the ideology of Xi Jinping that emerges out of these documents? You've described it as Marxist-Leninist nationalism, a turn to the Marxist left. For an American audience who's not that familiar with these terms we've been bandying around, what's your sort of synthesis of it?
Let me answer it at two levels. The first is, I've read enough of Xi Jinping to conclude that he is a convinced Marxist dialectician. What do I mean by that? Because it's not a term that we bandy around at Starbucks much here in New York. But it's important we understand how the other person thinks. But more importantly, their methodology, their epistemology, the way in which they reach conclusions about that which is real and that which is not, that which is true and that which is false. But when a dialectician, which sounds like a horrible word, comes from Hegel, the German philosopher, adopted by Marx and Engels. And it is essentially a view of history that there are two fundamental sets of forces changing historical developments over time. One's called dialectical materialism, and the second is called historical materialism. So what the hell is that? Dialectical materialism is a worldview by Marxists which says that change in society, the economy and politics occurs between this constant push between progressive forces and reactionary forces, which they ultimately describe as the forces of the working class versus the capitalist class. And ultimately, one pushes hard against the other, overturns the other, and creates a new synthesis, which ultimately is a communist state. And so that's dialectical materialism. And the Chinese Communist Party says
basically the inevitable historical engine that pushes through the capitalist state to communism.
That's true. And through the agency of what they call class struggle or just struggle. By the way, one of the things that Xi Jinping has rehabilitated as a term in China's political discourse today is struggle, 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 a term which largely disappeared during the Deng, Zhang, and Hu period. So bear with me for a moment. This is turgid stuff, and I apologize to your listeners.
This is a safe space for turgidity.
This is seriously
they know what to expect.
This is seriously turgid, and I've had to read this stuff, and I wouldn't recommend it to any of you unless you're suffering from deep insomnia. And I can give you the relevant chapters of my book, which will send you off to sleep. But historical materialism is the parallel discipline which asks Marxist historians this question: where are we in this current historical moment, in the evolution of this inexorable struggle between progressive and reactionary forces, between working class and the capitalist class, between working class nation states and capitalist nation states, in producing this final resolution through struggle of an evolution towards a socialist and communist society? And where they say, through historical materialism, China has reached, is that they are now moving out of what they call the primitive stage or the primary stage of socialism into something higher than that. And that the role of the Chinese Communist Party under Xi's leadership is to further accelerate that change. and applied to the nation state, not just China's society and economic experiment domestically, when they talk about changes not seen in 100 years, a favorite phrase of Xi Jinping, when they talk about the rise of the East and the decline of the West, these are all euphemisms for an historically materialist view that China's time has come in this inexorable process of dialectical change to emerge on top. So the reason I say all that is that it may sound like gobbledygook to you and me, and I don't really subscribe to any of it, but we would be wrong to conclude that this is not the analytical mechanism used in the central organs of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to understand where China is today and where the rest of the world is today.
Well, let me try to build that empathic bridge. I think to most of us in the U.S., even the socialists in the U.S. are, sometimes they pretend to be Marxists. I've met relatively few who truly believe in dialectical materialism or historical materialism. And I think if you're here and you're trained in the way we see our society, the way we do our thinking, the idea that history is linear in that way, teleological in that way, that there are forces playing out that fairly inevitably are moving towards a certain end state. I actually find this the hardest thing to believe that other people believe. Right? This is the belief. I can imagine why you believe a communist state is better or a social state is better, but the belief that it is driving in that way, that history has a direction, is, I think, often the hardest part of the pill to swallow. But as I understand what you're saying, is that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party do believe that history has a shape. And that shape is very important to the way they understand their role and structure their governance and direct their society. Is that fair?
That is a fair summary. Remember this, shall we say, teleological trajectory of which you spoke just before, has not historically been unique to Marxism-Leninism. There's been, Judeo-Christian variants of this at various times in history, moving towards an ultimate telos, which is the realization of the kingdom of heaven on earth, etc. I'm a bit like you. I'm somewhat skeptical about both these propositions. But when you describe and said just before, this is the way they think, that history has its own force, that it is moving, and you can make it move more rapidly through the agency of a Leninist party. That is precisely what they think, and would be analytically derelict if we did not explain that to others as saying this underpins their ultimate analysis of where the rest of us fit in the world and where they think they are taking China today. They call it scientific socialism.
But there's the other dimension that it is also, for Xi Jinping, specifically Chinese. And so attached to this theory of, this communist theory of history, this Marxist theory of history, is also a theory of China's history and its role in history. So how does Xi's nationalism, his story of China and its role in the world, play into this?
I argue in the book that simultaneously to these shifts to the Marxist and Leninist left, there's been a shift to the nationalist right, by which I mean a permanent and growing appeal to China's own inherent nationalism, anchored in its civilizational achievements in the past, anchored in we've been badly done by the rest of the world during the 100 years of foreign humiliation from the Opium Wars through the end of the war with Japan in 1945. And now we're on this trajectory to make China once again a global great power and the global superpower. And be proud about that. Be super proud about that. So you have this turbocharge of history in the nation, the nation now being the vessel or the vehicle through which this great ideological enterprise of Marxism-Leninism is therefore realized into the future, and will become the vehicle through which that is then taken into the world.